All right, Mr. Acting Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thanks for your time.
So, Mr. Secretary, let's start off with the supplemental request that the department has made of Congress. You're asking for more money, saying that the crush at the border is just overwhelming DHS resources.
Right.
Now, as you and I are speaking right now, thousands of people are being apprehended at our southern border, requesting asylum, and eventually being released, many of them, into the interior of the country. Many Americans, however, feel like this border crisis was just sprung upon us, that
Right.
it just materialized out of nowhere. Outline for us, how did we get to the point at where we are right now,
Sure.
and what needs to be done about it?
All right, let's start with the supplemental, where you started. $4.5 billion request. On Wednesday, it'll be 5 weeks since the administration sent it up to the Hill. We've seen no productive action on that request. $3.3 billion of it is simply for Health and Human Services, the entity that's charged by law for taking care of unaccompanied children that arrive at our border, to take care of kids and to deal with the numbers that we're seeing at the border. I think Congress needs to act immediately on this request. HHS needs that funding. The only alternative is those children have to wait in CBP custody, and this means a Border Patrol station, a port of entry, where essentially all we have is cells for detaining adults, usually, for very short periods of time. So to have children in that scenario is not right, and we need Congress to provide that money for HHS. The $1.1 billion for Department of Homeland Security is also critical, though. That's humanitarian funding for facilities, for transportation, for medical care, for food and consumables while we have people in our custody, which is also critical, but also $300 million for single adult beds for ICE. We've seen an increase in people crossing. This is the one segment of the population crossing where we have effective immigration enforcement right now, where we can complete an immigration proceeding with a judge and actually repatriate those people that don't have a valid claim to stay in the United States. We need that funding. We've asked for it. We've demonstrated the validity of that request, and we would like to work with Congress to get it done.
Are you seeing any action on that front from Congress, or do you have any reason currently to be optimistic that you're going to see that action taken for the funding that you need?
Well, it's disappointing that it was separated from the disaster relief bill, which we were hoping was going to move together. But we want to work with both the House and the Senate, different majorities, obviously, to pull this together and move it forward as quickly as we can.
So these numbers sound quite big to a layperson. Right. Can you just explain to our audience, what is the scale of the numbers that we're dealing with here?
The last 3 weeks, we've averaged almost 4,500 people crossing our border, either unlawfully, over 90% of them, or presenting at ports of entry without documents or a lawful right to stay in the U.S. All of those people have to be processed. About 65–70% of them right now are not even trying to evade capture. These are families and children that are just walking up to a Border Patrol agent to start their process in their immigration proceedings in the U.S. Now, given the backlog we have in our immigration courts, 900,000 people waiting for adjudication. That's a 2 to 5 year process. In some jurisdictions, it's even longer. So people know they'll be allowed to stay during the pendency of their proceedings and not going to be removed for years into the future. So this is a huge challenge. It's resulted in a big incentive to come to the U.S. now, especially if you're coming as a family or an unaccompanied child. And the numbers we're seeing are absolutely at record levels, especially for families and children. But even the overall flow right now is going back to historic highs. So it's a huge challenge for us operationally. We need legislative changes to address it, and we need supplemental funding to manage it.
Can you tell us what the border numbers are for May, now that we're here?
We're a few days out from finalizing the numbers for May. The systems don't normalize till about a week after the month ends, but they're going to be higher than April.
And what were they in April? Just for
there were 109,000 crossings,
which puts us on track for over 1 million over the course of the year if things do not change.
Correct. Yeah, we're towards 1 million because we started the year a little bit lower. Yes.
So, sir, there's been discussions here in Washington about a safe third country agreement with Mexico. The Mexican foreign minister came out today and said that is not an acceptable position. Are you disappointed to hear that from them?
So we need to work with Mexico on this problem. The president's made that explicitly clear. Obviously, he's implemented a plan to place additional tariffs on goods coming from Mexico because he really needs Mexico to step up and address the flow through their country. At any given time right now, we have 100,000 people transiting through Mexico towards our U.S. border. This is a very overt movement. It uses commercial bus lines. These are organized criminal organizations that are smuggling humans. We need Mexico to interdict that. We also want to support their efforts on their southern border in Chiapas. There's about a 150-mile stretch where most of these crossings occur between Guatemala and Mexico. We need them to interdict these folks at the point of origin crossing their border. And then, yes, we would like to partner with Mexico on effective strategies to take care of those people, that small percentage of this flow that actually has a refugee or asylum claim that has merit. They should be protected as soon as they're in a safe place. And Mexico has really invested in their resources for processing asylum claims. We'd like to recognize their system and coordinate our approach regionally. That would be a much more effective strategy than allowing people to be smuggled through their territory.
So before we get into the tariffs in Mexico, just tell us back on the supplemental agreement. What is going to happen if you don't get that? What are the pressures that everyday Americans are going to start feeling at home?
So if we don't get the supplemental funding, you're going to see children backing up at the border in CBP facilities in conditions that no American would be comfortable with in terms of how we care for children. Congress has to act on that funding. If we don't get the funding for the single adult bed space, there's only three options. We're either going to have to release adults, which is the one population that we're enforcing immigration law against effectively, or we're going to have to take cuts elsewhere in the Homeland Security budget in the middle of the year without planning. That means there's going to be parts of the department that people rely on, like TSA, like other elements of CBP.
So longer wait times at
That's a potential result. Yeah. We're going to try to minimize operational impact no matter how we have to deal with this. But we're going to have to transfer money from other accounts if we don't get Congress's help to address what's happening in a crisis flow at the border. That's why you send an emergency supplemental in, to address an emergent situation.
Well, you've outlined a crisis level situation, pressures on the United States government, the Department of Homeland Security, but many Democrats in the House of Representatives, where this ultimately needs support, they've demonized your organization. They've suggested that border enforcement itself is a criminal act. So do you really expect them to give you the resources of what you need to process what's going on at the border?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do is have a conversation that's based on a shared set of facts. Here's what's happening at the border. Here's why it's happening. Here are the criminal organizations that are profiting from it. And here are the vulnerable populations being put at risk. We can all agree that people are crossing our border in unprecedented numbers, especially families and children, and that people are dying on the journey. Let's work together to address that.
I would like for you to explain that. There's a common refrain here that things are only going back in the numbers to the way they were in the mid-2000s. Yeah. Why is it qualitatively different? You mentioned women and children. Now, I'm familiar with the asylum law, but it's a complicated point that many Americans don't understand.
Let's explain that. The historic immigration flows, talking about like the peak levels in the early 2000s, were almost all single adults from Mexico, usually male, usually coming to work in the agriculture industry. It was a seasonal flow. It was repeated. A lot of people that we saw multiple times. And in that flow, Border Patrol was able to repatriate adults quickly back to Mexico. There wasn't a serious problem with keeping people in custody for a long period of time, and it was something that we were addressing as the crossings happened. Families and children coming from further away, Central America and beyond, it's a completely different set of requirements. You have to have care for children. You have to work on appropriate facilities. You have to transfer them quickly to Health and Human Services. And there are many fewer options for actually enforcing immigration law against those populations because of court orders that require releases. So it's a completely different scenario that we're facing today. It is more dangerous. It is a huge profit center for criminal organizations. And it's something that we don't have the ability to effectively secure the border because of the weakness of our legal framework.
And what percent of those asylum cases are ultimately decided as legitimate in the United States
you
court?
just highlighted a key aspect of this flow. It was very rare to see asylum claims the first decade of the 2000s. Less than 1% of people we apprehended at the border were claiming asylum. In the first few months of this year, it was closer to 30% of those crossing were claiming asylum. That process is a two-step process. So the first assessment is, does this person have a credible fear of return to their country? That means they have to show a possibility that they can prove an asylum case. That's a very low bar. 87% of people are getting through that first bar. At the end of an asylum case, however, the immigration judges are only finding 10 to 15% have a valid asylum claim. The problem is that the time between that first assessment and the second can be years and years, which means they're here in the U.S. Without resolution, and that means more people are going to come to take advantage of that gap between the first bar and the second one.
So one of the intersecting parts of your purview is also review over keeping the United States safe from terrorism. Have you seen any uptake or troubling cases of terrorists trying to exploit the southern border and the crisis that's going on right now?
So as part of this flow at our southern border, we are seeing people from all over the world, from countries as far away as the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, making their way to our southwest border through South America and the long land bridge up to our border. Within that flow, we have to check very carefully to make sure we don't have a security threat involved. We do not have any cases of a terrorist operative attempting to enter through the border at this time, but it's something we monitor very vigilantly. We're very worried about, given the source of these countries that have a lot of terrorist nexus, that have conflict zones that are active, that could have training going on. We want to make sure that none of these people arriving present a risk to the American people.
So let's also turn to the tariffs. So the president, as you said previously, he's going to impose a 5% tariff on Mexico, with scaling upwards over a period of time if they do not do more to curb illegal immigration. Specific demands were not made. Now, you met with the Mexican foreign minister on Sunday. Can you outline for us what was the message that was delivered to them on what the United States needs to see from Mexico, not necessarily to avoid the tariffs, but at least to have a conversation going and make the president happy?
So I think the president's been very clear. He wants a vast reduction in crossings unlawfully through Mexico. He believes Mexico can do more to address this flow from Central America, and that's the number one metric that we're looking for. Some of the specific things that I offered on the announcement date was, look, we want to work with Mexico to secure the southern border, as I was talking about, that stretch in Chiapas on the Guatemala border where most of these crossings occur. We have to address the transportation. There are natural choke points. There's an isthmus in southern Mexico that's only about 100 miles wide, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. There are multiple transportation choke points, both for vehicles and rail in southern Mexico. We want to stop that flow there, and we're encouraging our Mexican partners to take those actions. We're also sharing intelligence. We're giving them all the information we have on the organizations that are moving migrants through Mexico that need to be dismantled, that need to be taken down, as this is not a lawful activity. And so those are the things we're asking. We also want to partner on our northern border. We can't have a situation where 1,000 people in one group can walk across the border at 4 a.m. without any interdiction or without any effort to stop that unlawful activity.
And we have a safe country agreement with Canada, correct?
We do.
Can you explain the mechanics of what exactly a safe country agreement? It sounds very complicated, but
it's not. It's actually a recognition of a partner government's asylum system.
Okay.
That they have a full and fair process for assessing whether somebody who's seeking protections under a refugee or asylum process can get that result from that government. Of course, we recognize Canada's asylum system. Mexico's made a lot of investments to improve their asylum process. This administration has added significant resources to their asylum process and has processed a number of refugee and asylum claims in the last 6 months. We think that should be recognized. And if we align regionally that we all trust each other's asylum process, that means that the first time you're in a safe country for an asylum proceeding, you should go ahead and make your claim there.
So Mexico, which is currently a state which is unable to even stop transnational criminal organizations from transiting its entire country, is not currently recognizing the asylum process of the United States. Is that essentially what it means?
We don't have an agreement.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that they don't think the U.S. asylum system
Well, their
is
foreign
valid.
minister came out today and said it is not an acceptable agreement for Mexico.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's something we'll have to talk about further, because we think it's one of the most effective ways to address this problem.
So outside of a safe country agreement, what does Congress need to do to change the laws? Change the law is something that the president says all the time, but let's get specific here. There's humanitarian laws. There's actually trafficking laws that prevent and require holding for certain periods of time. Outline it for us specifically. What are the things that need to change, and what's the current legislation that's within the United States Senate that can do that?
Right. So there's only 3 changes that we're asking for to address this immediate crisis. The first is changing the rules on how long families can stay in custody. We're talking about keeping families together in an appropriate facility for a fair and expedited proceeding. That's the number one change that we need that would address the vast majority of the population coming to the border right now. Right now we're limited to 21 days, which is not long enough to get a family through a proceeding in immigration court with effective due process. We need a little bit longer, and we'd like Congress to lift that restriction. 2, we need the ability for unaccompanied children, like we have with Mexico and Canada, to repatriate them safely in partnership with the government where they came from. This is something that we'd like to work on with Congress. We've offered the ability for kids to apply for protection safely in Central America, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But if they avoid that process, we need to be able to return them from the United States effectively. And then third, address that asylum gap that I outlined, the 87% on the front end and the 10% on the back end. We want to change the standards so that you still get all the valid asylum cases through to a court, but at the end of the day, it's a closer match from the front end to the back end.
There have been a
Those
limited
are the
number.
three things.
Sure.
Just real quick,
Yeah.
Chairman Graham has introduced a
Yeah.
bill
Right.
that addresses all three of those pillars. We'd like to work with Democrats in the Senate and then ultimately the House to get that bill moving.
So there's been a limited number of cases of children who've been dying in United States custody. Outline for us why that is happening and
Right.
what steps the department is trying to take. And I believe that one of the supplemental requests is to try and mitigate such events.
100%.
Yes.
I mean, this is something we're extraordinarily concerned about. In December, we had the first 2 deaths of children in custody anywhere in our process in over 10 years. What we're seeing is a dramatic increase in the number of children flowing into the border. So it's not just the family units, right, but every unaccompanied child together. So in April, we had over 40,000 kids enter our process. And these are Border Patrol stations. These are police stations primarily. So what we're trying to do is surge resources to provide better facilities, sometimes a temporary facility that would add capacity at a station, medical care. We've gone from about 20 people providing professional medical care in Border Patrol stations on the border to over 200 today with both contract and partner government resources. We need to expand our ability to provide appropriate food, medicine, and blankets and other consumables for people in our care. That's what we've asked for in the supplemental. $800 million of that goes to how do we take care of people in our custody.
Final question for you, sir. Outline the dangers for children on this journey. We've seen cases of false paternity. We've seen
Right.
cases of sexual abuse. We've seen cases of dramatic exploitation
Right.
of children and so many of them being raped along the journey, girls as young as 10 years old.
Right.
Outline for us
It's
what effect
yeah.
what effect this ongoing crisis has on the children themselves who are being trafficked to this country.
It's extraordinarily dangerous. Unacceptable things are happening. It's a very dangerous journey that can take up to 3 to 4 weeks, depending on which smuggler, which organization, and how they're proceeding toward the border. One of the things we're most concerned about is an increasing incidence of adults bringing across children that are not their own. I had a gentleman in Guatemala last week tell me that everybody knows that bringing a child is a passport for migration right now. And so we have to take additional measures at the border, and we've done that. We have HSI teams now, about 500 special agents working this issue nationally, 140 on the border that are doing forensic interviews with adults that claim to be traveling with children that are their own, but we have suspicions. They've identified in the first 4 weeks 180 cases, 360 fraudulent documents, over 300 prosecutions of people that are purporting to be parents that aren't. In DNA testing, we've piloted that. In the first few days of that testing, we identified 24 people that were fraudulently claiming to be parents of a child crossing. How many more cases are out there where there's either a trafficking issue, a child being recycled and used by multiple adults to try to get into the U.S.? We need to stop that. And that's something that we're going to work with Guatemala on to do it up front at the Honduran-Guatemalan border as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, sir. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.